hurt you, anything can offend you, and anxiety is our innate response, we must learn to push back against a culture that seeks to coddle and combat these ideologies that are not only incongruent with the scriptures, but are damaging to our communities. We must challenge certain beliefs, correct faulty behaviors, and conform to our God-given dispositions. It is only then that we will be able to present ourselves and our future generations as anti-fragile, inanxious, and unoffendable. Character traits that will not only bode well, but will also be necessary for the days that are coming. Get ready to combat the coddling.
Well, good morning and welcome to Envoy, where we are a people following Jesus. To those not yet, it's great to be with you guys here today. We're going to be concluding this series called The Coddling today, but we're actually just beginning the conversation because the things that we've been talking about over the past few weeks are things that ultimately we need to be aware of, and we need to continue to have some conversations so that we don't kind of fall into the vices that our society and our culture are presenting in this time. And so just so you understand, if y'all are just now joining with us, this series is not meant to tell you how to think or what to believe or how to behave and that kind of stuff. It's meant to make us aware that there are voices within our culture that are speaking into our lives and our future generations. And if we're not careful, we'll allow those voices to shape how we act and interact with other people. And the reality is this: if we're not aware and we don't challenge those voices, we can get sucked into the cultural rhetoric that actually, I believe, causes us to mislead us, to coddle us, and even diminish us in certain ways. And so it's very, very necessary for us to be aware of those things. Now, I don't think that most of the conversation that's happening right now is ill-intended, but when we start to look at the results of this, we're not turning out what ultimately is intended, what is wanted, what is desired, and therefore we need to have those kind of conversations, and that's what we're doing in this series called The Coddling. Now, last week I introduced you to Psalm 139. You all know this psalm, but we were speaking in terms of anxiety last week. It said, "Search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts." So last week, as we talked about the ability to live inanxious, which doesn't mean apart from any kind of anxious thoughts, but being able to actually handle those and deal with those in a way that is both healthy for us and beneficial for others, right? We have the ability to have this alternative to anxiety. But this verse actually speaks further, and I wanted to give you all the second part of that verse. It says this: "Point out anything in me that offends you. Make me aware of the offenses in my life so that I might be able to be along the path of everlasting life." And so this week, we're actually going to turn our attention to the issue of offense and how we might actually be able to live as unoffendable. Now, as much as I've enjoyed some of the conversations that we've had about anti-fragile and anxious and things that are really important and prevalent in our society, this particular topic is one that I think is more prevailing in not only our society, but also our churches. And I think it's something that we need to be talking about. And I'm really excited to be able to talk to you all about this. And I happen to find this great instructional video for you all to watch. So take a look at this.
I've been having life-changing results since I learned how to get offended. Now, when people don't see things the way that I see them, I just get offended. And it teaches them how not to see things from their point of view. People have every right to see things from their perspective, as long as their perspective is the same as my perspective. There's 3 easy steps to getting offended by anything. Step 1, listen to what someone says, and then selflessly make it all about you by taking it personally, even if it has nothing to do with you. Step 2, you want to create a large amount of tension inside your body. You really want to concentrate on bringing the tension to your stomach, your chest, and your face. Step 3, now project outrage onto the other person. This will make it seem like you're getting rid of the tension inside your body, but it actually drives it down deeper inside you. And because it stays there, it'll make it even easier for you to get offended next time. Since I've learned how to get offended, I bring huge amounts of joy to everyone in my life. People feel like they're free to just be themselves when they're around me. I'm just happy I can make such a big difference in the world.
I love that video. Has anybody else noticed an uptick in offended people in our society lately? in our neighborhoods, on social media especially. We just do see that all over the place. And the scriptures actually, they tell us something about offended people. In Proverbs 18 it says, an offended friend is harder to win back than a fortified city. And so in this situation that we live, with the amount of easily offended individuals, what we're doing is we're creating a greater degree of enemies around us. We are causing people that could potentially be friends and brothers and allies, but we're causing offense and we're creating division among us. And it is harder to win back an offended friend than it is to be able to tackle a fortified city, is what the Proverbs tell us in that regard. Which means that our society, we are creating more impasses and more barriers and more division that is harder for us to be able to mend these things. And therefore, we need to address this. We need to have some conversation, because it seems that people have found reasons to be offended by almost anything these days, right? We see people being offended by all sorts of things. If you disagree with me, I'm offended by you. If I'm left out of a social activity that I didn't even want to be a part of, but now social media tells me that happened and I wasn't invited to, I'm now offended, right? You all have experienced this, right? If someone has made a change and they didn't consult me about this particular change and I don't like it, guess what? I'm offended by this particular thing. If somebody challenges me or corrects me, of course I'm offended by that. If they forgot my birthday, doesn't matter if they even know me or not. They just forgot my birthday. I'm offended by them. If they walked past me and they didn't say hi to me, or I called them and they didn't call back in a timely manner, I'm offended by that. If they ask a question that actually made an assumption, I'm offended. If they honked at me in traffic because I'm on my phone and I don't realize that there is a green light in front of me, how dare they honk at me, even whenever I'm in the wrong and I'm distracted, right? I'm offended. We found all sorts of things to be easily offended by, and this list it's seemingly endless and ever increasingly fickle. Now, there are certainly reasons to be offended in this life. I'm just not sure if there's any good reasons. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. We're going to have some more conversations about the benefit of actually being offended or not. There are reasons to be offended, but I don't think that they necessarily justify our response. But who am I to determine what you should be offended by? Because you have the right to be offended. Pretty sure that's like in the Miranda law, right? You have the right to be offended. Anything they say or do will be held against them in a court of social law, both now and forevermore. You have the right to be offended. But just because you are offended doesn't make you right. You've probably seen some of those bumper stickers out there, right? But this is the nature and the notion that is being communicated within our society. Oftentimes, that's what we're led to believe. If I feel offended, that means I must have been wronged. Do you all see this correlation? And therefore, if I have been offended, I must be right, because my offense actually leads me to think that I am, in fact, right. Now, this actually is a lot more gnarly than what you actually might think it can be. I call this the pathway to offense, because there's this thing that's happening within our culture right now, and if you're not aware of it, I want to make you aware of this so that you can see how this ultimately kind of plays out, because it doesn't just stop there. It starts with disagreement, but disagreement quickly becomes offense, because now instead of simply disagreeing with your viewpoint, I am now offended by your viewpoint. And I don't know where in society or in culture or in history that this started happening, where I equate my disagreement with you with offense, but that's exactly what's happening. Our society has all but equated these two things. Now, I personally believe that it is possible for me to vehemently disagree with you on certain things and not be offended by what it is that you believe. But that's not what our society is telling us. They're telling us that disagreement is, in fact, offense. And so I'm offended by your viewpoint, but now being offended by your viewpoint leaves me to feeling attacked by what it is that you believe and what you're actually saying, and emotionally damaged. And this is natural. If I feel attacked by what it is that you believe and my feelings are hurt, then your language is basically abusive to my psyche. And now, because I feel like you're abusing me or a group of other people that think like me, I have the right and the responsibility to stop you from sharing your views. Enter cancel culture that we've experienced over the last few years, and increasingly so. Because now I have an obligation not just to speak on my behalf because of the offense that you have brought to me, but because of other people that think like me. I owe it to them to be able to speak up and to cancel you. This is happening all across college cultures, by the way. The Coddling of the American Mind, which if you haven't read that book, a great book, and it talks about a lot of this type of stuff. It talks about the idea of these students that are so fragile in their thinking and so offended by somebody else that they're actually canceling other speakers that have differing viewpoints. But isn't that the purpose of higher education? To be able to see differing viewpoints and come to some conclusion on your own? But there's this phenomenon that's actually happening in that culture as well, which is really intriguing and very devastating to our culture. Because now your offense that has led to attack, which feels like abuse to me, doesn't only lead me to cancel you, it also justifies my physical violence and reaction towards you. Because now my emotional damage justifies physical violence. We see this happening within our culture. Guys, if we don't address this, if we don't correct this, if we don't help our kids see this, this is the path that our community and our society is leading us to. This distorted view of thinking leads to a very destructive pathway. Our culture is coddling us into offense. It's teaching us to be easily offended for the good of our fellow man, because offense is what causes people to do something about it, I guess. Now, lest you think that this is simply a societal thing, allow me to direct our attention to the inward part of this place and this group and this gathering of people, because church people are just as guilty of this kind of stuff as anybody else. As a matter of fact, I think that some of us believe that we have the spiritual gift of offense because of how easily offended we can get about stuff. We get offended by all sorts of stuff. The music style, the way we took communion, the pastor didn't use enough scripture, the people weren't friendly enough. I only got greeted by 3 different people on the way in. And the person that I wanted to greet me didn't actually greet me, so I'm offended, right? They stopped using the program that I liked. They asked us to give ever. We even get offended on God's behalf, as if he needs defending. The offense is great, and it's prevalent, and it's prominent within our churches. Now, we don't typically come to blows in the church unless it's a church softball league, right? But the way in which we respond to our offense and the way in which we demonstrate our offense is in things like slander and gossip and undermining of leadership and prideful responses and leaving the church over non-essential things and church splits. Guys, it's happening right here among us. Now, some of us, like myself, are tempted to have a conversation like this and talk about all these easily offended people, and our minds immediately to go to those people who need to hear this message, right? We immediately go to that person and we're like, oh yeah, my dad needs to hear this, right? Or, my friend at work, they need to hear this. This message is for them. You're probably already thinking about people you're going to send this to right now, right? But before you do that, I want to make sure that we understand that this message is for us first. We are the easily offended. And you might not even know that about yourself yet. You might not even think about that because you're like, oh no, I'm not easily offended. But when you stop to actually think about all the things in this life and all the people that you have these harshness to and this bitterness to and this resentment toward, oftentimes that starts because you've been offended in some way. So my hope and my prayer is that through our conversations today, as well as throughout the week, that we'll be mindful of those places in our lives where we've allowed offense to come easily to us and not to challenge that. For the purpose of today in our conversation, we're going to have this conversation by talking about a tale of 2 kings. And we're going to have a conversation about two different kings that actually display both an offense and an easily offendable nature and an unoffendable nature. And the first king that we're going to talk about today is a guy named King Saul. So if you got your Bibles, you can open them up to 1 Samuel chapter 18. That's where we're going to get started. King Saul, we're going to also call him King Saul the offended, all right? Or the offendable. He's the one that gets easily offended. If you don't know who he was the first king of Israel. He was tall, handsome, he's good looking, commanded respect. Originally, God said, I don't really want a king for this nation, but all the people around him were like, hey, all these other kingdoms have kings. We want a king. He's like, okay, I'll give you a king. And so they gave him King Saul, and he actually did a pretty good job to get started, but ultimately, his pride and his offense led him to his downfall as a king. Right? And we're going to pick up in verse 6 here. And let me give you just a little bit more context. King Saul and all of Israel has been plagued by the Philistines. And these guys have been like perennial pains in the butts to these guys. Right? And they're having a lot of success. They've suffered a bunch of defeats. And so now they got this big guy named Goliath. He's out there mocking their armies. And they're kind of sitting there waiting on things to happen. Up and comes this young shepherd boy. His name's David. He goes over, challenges him, does this whole slingshot thing, knocks him down, kills him. They start pursuing all the other armies. Saul puts David in charge of his commanding officers, and they're having all sorts of success. And here's where we find ourselves in chapter 18, verse 6. It says this: when the victorious Israelite army was returning home after David had killed the Philistine, women from all the towns of Israel came to meet King Saul, and they sang and danced for joy with tambourines and cymbals, and this was their song: Saul has killed his thousands. Woo! Way to go, Saul! And David his 10,000s. Uh-oh. Y'all see where this is going, right? Y'all can sense Saul's angst already in the moment. This made Saul very angry. What's this? He said. They credit David with 10,000s and me with only thousands. Next, they'll be making him their king. So from that time on, Saul kept a jealous eye on David. Let's break this down here for a moment, okay? As I mentioned before, the Philistine armies have been plaguing the Israelite armies. Finally, they're seeing a change in the tide. They're seeing success in this. They're going out and destroying these Philistine armies. They come back and they're victorious. Saul should have been celebrating this great victory. Not only over the Philistines, but the fact that God had now given him this ally in David who had his favor, and he was able to put him in charge of these things and have success. This should have been a successful celebrating time. Instead, though, Saul chooses not to focus on the success, and instead he focuses on the offense. And whether this was intended or unintended by these ladies who were singing this song, the king over the entire nation all of a sudden allows his offense to become jealousy over this shepherd boy from nowhere land. And he harbors this resentment. And you start to see exactly what he does in this moment. He allows his offense that leads to jealousy to then start projecting all kinds of negative thoughts about the future of both this guy and his kingdom based on his offense. He was easily offended, and then he sat right squarely in the midst of his offense. And that's where he stood. That's where he stayed. And it continues on in verse 10. It says, the very next day, a tormenting spirit from God overwhelmed Saul. And he began to rave in his house like a madman. David was playing the harp, as he did each day, but Saul had a spear in his hand, and suddenly he hurled it at David, intending to pin him to the wall. Not just to kill him, he wanted to pin him to the wall, right? And it tells us, I think this is so funny, David escaped him twice. Don't you think that David might have gotten a hint on the first time that the spear came at him, right? But he escaped Saul twice in this situation. Now, we're not told exactly what this spirit is, but I want to give that spirit a name today. I believe that what Saul was dealing with was the spirit of offense. I believe it was the spirit of offense that came and sat squarely on his throne alongside of Saul. It's a spirit that's actually very prominent and prevalent in our society today. And when we sit in offense, it has its way of actually consuming us to the point where we actually act and respond just like Saul did. He was so consumed with this that he became mad in this moment, so offended that he lashed out and tried to kill David while David was simply trying to serve the king. He was literally there playing the harp to soothe the king. But in this moment, Saul doesn't see a servant. Saul only sees someone he's offended by. And that's exactly what happens to us when we get offended. When we get offended, we no longer see people the way that they are. We see people through their offense. That's how it works. We get so focused in on the offense itself that we don't even get to see what else is going around. Offended people can become irrational and easily irritated because they can't see past the offense. It shapes the way that you see another person or a people group. We know this from our own personal experiences, right? Have you ever been offended by somebody and that person that you were offended by tries to do something nice for you? Have you ever been in that situation? In that moment, you don't see something nice, do you? You see the motivation behind the nice thing because that person is an offender and therefore they're incapable of doing something nice for you. You see them through the offense. You won't even allow, like whatever they do or whatever they say, you actually try to use it against them. We do this because that's what offense does to us. They are deserving of my anger, and they have what's coming to them. David was simply trying to play the harp for his king to soothe his mind, and a spear gets thrown at him. That's what offense causes us to do. In verse 14, it says this: David continued to succeed in everything he did, for the Lord was with him. And when Saul recognized this, he became even more afraid of him. So we've seen offense leads us to jealousy. We've seen offense resulting in anger. Here we see offense resulting in fear. And the reality is that we're afraid of things that we don't understand. And these days, we're being taught and told and conditioned to be afraid of things that we disagree with. We are afraid of things that we disagree with because those viewpoints and those thoughts can actually help shape something that we don't necessarily want. And when we are offended, we are in fact blinded. We only see what we want to see. And then that fear, it actually drives us to do things and say things that we would not otherwise do in a right mind. But because we are consumed by it, we've given in to it, we have been manipulated by this spirit of offense, that we end up doing and saying things that we would never do. And in 1 Samuel 19:1, it says, Saul now urged his servants and his son Jonathan to assassinate David. Guys, this is one chapter's worth of information. One chapter we get from hail the conquering hero, the guy who killed Goliath, the guy who's in charge of the armies bringing all sorts of success, to, hey, let's kill the dude because I am offended by him. Guys, it goes from they sang a song about you to I want to assassinate you. I don't know how we get there, but that's what offense does. And in our day and age, this idea of assassination comes in different forms. Certainly, it leads sometimes to violence, and we've seen this. We see this even, and this is not a political statement at all, but we've seen this with people trying to kill and assassinate a former president of the United States because they disagree with his thoughts and viewpoints. Guys, that's a bad news situation on either side of the political party, like allowing our feelings about things to want to try to physically harm somebody. Bad news, right? But in our day and age, we're a lot more subtle with how we assassinate people. We silence them. We discredit them. We slander them. We cancel them. We threaten them. We assassinate their character. And we have a lot of courage behind a keyboard. These days and age, it doesn't matter if you call yourself a Christian or not. When you get offended by something, we go straight to that keyboard or that phone and we just start typing stuff. And we just let it rampant, right? Like we just let it loose and we say whatever we want to say because we're not talking to somebody face to face. There's not a person behind the thought. All we're doing is we're allowing those thoughts to run rampant, and we don't act very Christian that way. And we allow our offense to actually create assassination attempts on other people. Chapter 20, verse 1, David comes to the conclusion. He goes, how have I offended your father? He's talking to Jonathan at this point. In such a way that he's so determined to kill me. Guys, this is not just a passive thing anymore. King Saul has now pursued David. He's coming after David. He is so fixated on the offense that he wants to hurt David like David hurt him. But help me a little bit in understanding this. How exactly did David hurt Saul? You go back to that story, you go all throughout the process, there's nothing that David does. There's nothing that David says that Saul should even take an offense too. He heard some songs from some girls and he got offended by David. And it's led him to want to kill him. Here's the bottom line. Saul's resentment has now turned David into his enemy, and he's prepared to take things into his own hands. And isn't that what we do when we get offended? Not only are we not able to see things, not only does it blind us, but our offense actually changes the way in which we see other people. People who could otherwise be allies. So, like David, he was anointed to become the next king. Saul could have seen this guy as an ally to help lead these things, to kind of live out his legacy, to be able to help raise him up. David saw Saul as being kind of a father figure to help him become the next king of Israel. But instead of being able to see him as an ally, his offense caused him to see him as an enemy. And that's exactly what we do every time that we create an us and them category. Every time somebody who doesn't think like us, believe like us, act like us, look like us, we call them a them. We put them in a them category, and it's easy for us to demonize them, to speak illy of them, and then them become enemies of us. And an offended brother is harder to win back than a fortified city. This is how it is to be offended. And this is what we experience with many other people in our nation. This is what we see not only within our society, but don't we see it in our own relationships? That progression, that pathway to offense, what I showed you all earlier, not just happening on our college campuses. You know where else it's happening? In our homes, with our spouses. When they say something that is not just in disagreement to us, but then it causes an offense, and all of a sudden we feel like it's an attack, and then we call it an abuse, and then we shut them out of our life, or we justify whatever harsh words or violence that we offer back to them. And we break down the fabric of that marriage, and we break down the fabric of those friendships, and we break down the fabric of our brothers and sisters in Christ that we do this with. This happens all the time. This is how offense works. There's got to be another way. Thank goodness there is another way. We have another option. We don't have to be easily offended. We can actually be unoffendable like King David. He's our second prototype that we're going to take a look at here today. King David, the unoffendable. We're going to take a look at his side of the story because he demonstrates some things that are completely countercultural and contrary to our general human nature. 1 Samuel chapter 24 says, after Saul returned from fighting the Philistines, he was told that David had gone into the wilderness of En-Gedi. So Saul chooses 3,000 elite troops from all over Israel and went to search for David and his men near the rocks of the wild goats. Again, he is so fixated on the situation, even though he's still at war with the Philistines, he's at war with David because he's his enemy, and he's going after him. He's going to go pursue him. He's going to take his life. It just so happens that they camp right outside of the rock structure that David and his men happen to be in. Not only that, funny parts of the story. The Bible's so funny, I tell you. Saul ends up going up to the very cave that they're hiding in, and he goes into the cave to relieve himself. And at this moment, David has every opportunity to be able to go in and take care of business, the other kind of business. He could take his life, right? He could end it. He could just, like in this whole pursuit, at that moment, he could dispose of the king, but he chooses another way. And what I want you guys to do is I want you to take a moment to actually check this story out for yourselves, okay? I want us to take a time we're going to do this table talk. I'm going to give you about 5 minutes to gather up with some people that are near to you. And what I want you to do is these two things. I want you to read 1 Samuel 24, 8 through 12. I want you to take a look at David's response and how he chooses to respond to this situation. And I want you to discuss what it looks like to be unoffendable. So go ahead and gather together, introduce yourselves, read that passage, discuss the conversation. We'll come back and talk about it in a minute. All right, guys, I'm going to bring you all back here. Thank you so much for reading the Word of God and having some discussions about what that looks like. I'm sure that you all probably were able to see this prototype of this King David who's unoffendable. You're able to deduce some things on your own with the people around you about what that actually looks like. I would like to be able to share some things that I kind of found in this passage as well of what does it look like to be unoffendable? What does an unoffendable person do? You know, based upon this story that we see, one of the first things we see is that David, an unoffendable man, gives the benefit of the doubt. He gives the benefit of the doubt. He gives the other person a chance to change. You see, oftentimes when we are offended, we automatically go to the worst case scenario when it comes to the other person. We have all these gaps, and we fill those gaps with the worst possible scenario of what their intentions were, what their motivation was. We start to mind read what they were thinking when they brought this to us, and we do not give them any kind of benefit of the doubt. We just give them a bunch of doubt. That's what we do, right? We doubt their character. We doubt their intentions. But ultimately what we see is David gives the benefit of the doubt. Yes, Saul has thrown a spear at me, right? Yes, Saul is pursuing me, but I still think that there's something good in him. I still think there's something worthy in him. And so I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt that I can spare his life in this situation and that he will do what the right thing is in that situation. So he gives him the benefit of the doubt. I think many of us, when we start to feel offended by people or things, if we were able to actually think kindly and give kind of a generous opinion of somebody else, it would help us to be able to process through that offense a little bit better. The second thing that we see here in this story is that he refuses retribution. And he has every right in the world to retaliate towards King Saul in this situation. King Saul has made David's life just this incredibly challenging and difficult scenario. He's on the run for his life. He's going all these different places. He's out in the desert. He doesn't have a place to sleep, doesn't have food over his head. God has these things for him to go and do, and he's not living in his purpose. He's hiding in caves. He has every right to retribution in this situation, yet he chooses to spare King Saul's life in this moment. Not only here, we also see this a little bit later with Abishai. They sneak into the camp while they're sleeping, and they're right there. And Abishai's like, "Hey, I could kill him right now. Like the Lord has delivered him into your hands." And David says the same thing then that he says here. No, we're not going to do that because I'm refusing the right of retaliation. Which kind of goes into this next piece here. He also extends grace when faced with hostility. Not only does he refuse to be able to pay back evil, but instead he actually offers good. Do you see the way that he speaks about Saul to his men? This is an amazing thing, and I think it's a phenomenal insight for us to be able to gain. Because when we're offended by people, we only see the worst in people, and therefore we speak those things, right? But what David does is he sees the very worst side of Saul, and he still speaks into the best parts of Saul. And he allows room for the anointed of God. He speaks positive things about him in this regard. He does not give him what he deserves. He does not pay evil for evil, but gives a blessing instead. What an incredibly powerful thing for an unoffendable person to be able to do. And then we see this all playing out because this unoffendable person also confronts the offense. This is very, very important. We're going to talk a little bit more about that here in a minute, but he addresses the situation with hopes to resolve it. He doesn't let Saul just wander out of the cave and never hear about this thing. On the way out of the cave, he stops and acknowledges him. He's given away his position, by the way. He's got a much smaller army than what's coming out to pursue him. He's giving the benefit of the doubt that Saul is actually going to do the right thing, but instead of letting the offense just go by, he actually addresses the offense with the king. He says, "I don't know what people have been telling you. I don't know what it is that you come to believe about me, but those things are not true. See today that the way in which I have acted and behaved, that it will challenge the way in which you have seen me up until this point, and that you will actually turn, and we could resolve this thing together." That was his hopes. And the last thing that I see an unoffendable person doing is they give the Lord space to work instead of taking things into their own hands. Saul, when he was offended, takes things into his own hands. He wants to justify himself. He wants to deal with this offense. Instead, David, who is himself offended by Paul's reactions, he does not take this into his own hand. He gives space for God to be able to work, for his Spirit to be able to move. And I think in our situations, guys, oftentimes we are way too quick to justify our responses. They've offended me, they've hurt me, they've said these things. I need to react, I need to retaliate, I need to take this into my own hands. And what do we end up doing? We end up making more of a mess of things, don't we? Because oftentimes we don't give space for God to actually do what he does best. You see, when it comes down to it, offense is inevitable. But being offended is a choice. I don't know if we framed it this way before or not in our minds. But I think that this is the way that we need to frame this, not only as followers of Jesus, but also people desiring a different result in our society and in our culture. Offense is inevitable, but being offended is actually a choice. You get to decide whether or not to take something personal. You get to make that choice. Therefore, the power is in your hand, not in the offender's hand. It's in your hands. I was having a conversation with a friend of mine the other day. This friend happened to have a little different skin color than I do, and I made a comment, and I said something that could have been construed in a way that could have caused offense. But my friend, instead of taking offense at what I had said, and then me taking offense at him, that he took offense to what I said. That's how it works, right? But instead of taking offense, instead what he did was he stopped and he helped me understand that what I said could be taken as offense. And we had this discussion, and he was able to give me insight and understanding, all because he didn't choose to take that personally. And because he didn't take it personally, I was able to gain greater understanding. Man, wouldn't we be a much better society and church and family if we gave people the benefit of the doubt and we allowed people to have better understanding instead of taking offense and taking things personal? And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you the secret sauce. I'm going to put on my counselor's hat. I'm going to give you a solution to all of our problems with offense today. You all ready for this? All right, lean in, get your pencils ready. Here you go. Ready? Stop taking things so personally. Write it down. You're probably offended by that right now, right? Okay. So here's the deal. Here's the deal. That's not something that you should say to somebody else, although I just said it to you, okay? That's not a weapon to be used in a conversation with somebody else who's taking offense to that. That is something that we should be telling ourselves on a regular basis. When that offense starts to come and we start to feel it, we start to see ourselves posture a little bit, we start to get defensive or prideful or whatever it is, we need to tell ourselves to stop taking it so personally. Or because we're offended, what is it in me that is actually offended by this? Why am I taking this so personally? So that you can resolve it and work through it and ultimately let it go, because I don't need to be offended. We have the right to be offended, but of what benefit is it for us to actually stay in that offense? I don't see any. I'm not seeing any. Not only in our societal outcomes, but also certainly within Jesus's direction and instruction to us. And we'll get to that in a minute. Now, deciding to be unoffendable doesn't mean overlooking an offense. It does mean choosing to overcome it by not being offended by it, okay? Let me mind that a little bit. It doesn't mean ignoring something that is offensive to us, because like we said, offense is inevitable. You're going to be offended. There are going to be times where you feel that coming on. What it does mean is that we address the offense without taking it personal. As a matter of fact, I believe that in order for us to become unoffendable persons, like, it means that we actually have to dive into the offense. We can't just let it sit out there and not deal with it and ignore it and think that it doesn't actually hurt our feelings. Otherwise, we may be tempted to store it away and allow bitterness and resentment to build within us without even knowing it. That's what happens. So, like, offense needs to be addressed. I'm not saying it needs to be ignored. I'm just saying that you don't have to take it personally. There are healthy ways for us to be able to deal with it. A side note, unoffended people are also not out of touch with their feelings. They feel very deeply. They acknowledge that what was said and done was hurtful or offensive, but they choose not to stay in that place. They are, in fact, emotionally healthy people. It's what we need in our society, in our churches, in our homes. Here's the deal. If you happen to find yourself being offended, whose job is it to deal with that offense? Yours. Now, this sounds a little bit countercultural, because whoever offended you, it should be their job, right? But that's not what the scriptures say. If you're the one with the offense, you're the one who has been offended, you know what the scriptures tell us? It's your job to actually address the offense, because it's very likely that the other party has no clue that they even offended you in the first place. And that's not fair to them. In Matthew 18, it actually gives us a prescription for what we're supposed to do. It says, if another believer sins against you, go privately, not publicly, not on social media, not in the group setting, not in front of your family, right? Go privately and point out the offense. Let them know, hey, what you said, what you did, how you acted, it bothered me. It hurt my feelings. It was something that was inappropriate, right? You caused some kind of offense to me. And if the other person listens and confesses it, you have won that person back. An offended brother is harder to reclaim than a fortified city. How do we help an offended brother come back to being a friend? We go to them with whatever offense that we've had against them. We are the ones that actually need to initiate that. We need to respond instead of reacting to these situations. I'm going to go ahead and invite the band back up here. I'm not quite done yet. I want to walk you guys through this last part, because I think it might be the linchpin in regards to this issue of being unoffendable. Because ultimately, our ability to be unoffendable is rooted in our own forgiveness. There's a guy named Brant Hansen who wrote a book called Unoffendable, in addition to another book called The Bait of Satan, both great resources with this topic. But this is what he has to say. He says, when you're living in the reality of the forgiveness that you've been extended, you just don't get angry with others easily. It's not that it never happens, it doesn't happen easily because you're constantly living in the reality of your own forgiveness. And then he goes on to say this, and I think it's incredibly insightful, at least for me. I suspect that our sense of entitlement to anger is directly proportional to our perception of our own relative innocence. In other words, when you think that you've not done anything worth being forgiven over, when you don't think that you actually need the grace of Jesus in your own life, then it's a lot easier to be offended by other people and hold things against them. But when you come face to face with the reality of all of the offenses that you have personally offended God by, all the different sins, all of the things, when you come to the reality of your desperate need for God's grace and forgiveness in your own life, then it causes us to see other people and their offenses in a completely different way. See, our ability to live without offense is directly proportional to our grasp on grace in our own life. I have offended my God in so many ways, yet he has chosen not to hold my offense against me. So who am I to hold someone else captive? I love what Max Lucado actually says about this. He says, forgiveness, setting someone else free, and then realizing that you are the prisoner. Guys, whatever and whomever is offending you, Jesus has already died for that. Whatever and whomever is offending you, Jesus has already died for it. He's already gone to the cross. He's already gone to the grave. He's already rose again. He's already extended his grace. So who am I to hold something else against somebody? The fact of the matter is that if we are followers of Jesus, and if we are putting ourselves at his mercy, if we're trying to reflect him to a lost and searching world, if we're trying to help those that are not yet following him to come to understand him, then you need to understand this. There is no room for being offended when you belong to Christ. There's no room to be an offendable person when you say that Jesus is your Lord and Savior, because we are to love our enemies. We are to forgive everyone for everything. We are to be slow to anger. We are to extend grace as we ourselves have received it. Offense is certainly our natural disposition, but Christ died to give us a supernatural disposition, one that says that we can be unoffendable. Let us pray. Lord, I'm confident. I'm confident that there are people here right now that are holding some offenses. Offenses that have skewed their view of others. Maybe entire people groups. It's blinded them. It's caused them not to be able to see the good. It's caused them to fixate on them and become the focus of their attention. Maybe they've even brought it in here to this room. Maybe they're even thinking about that person or that thing that person did right now. Lord, I pray that you help them see that there's an alternative to offense. It's called forgiveness. Lord, I pray that we would deal with those things today. And if there's anybody here today that has been offended, that they can actually come and they can leave those offenses at the foot of the cross. Lord, if there's anybody that I have particularly offended, Lord, I pray that we could have that conversation and we can address that so that we don't need to have any kind of angst between us. Lord, I pray that ultimately as we search our hearts and you search our hearts, that you would make us aware of not only the ways in which we've offended you, but the ways in which we ourselves have easily been offendable. Give us resistance and resilience, Lord, to become unoffendable people and show the rest of this world a different way. It's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen.